Introduce our guests for tonight. We have with us today Professor Liaquat Takim from Toronto,
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam, Aalima Zakia Batool Najafi from Islamabad, Sayyid Jaafar Fadlallah from Beirut, and Dr. Komail Rajani from Exeter. The topic for discussion on this night is the accuracy of the accounts surrounding the martyrdom of Imam Hussain alayhi salatu wassalam. As a prelude to the discussion, we will begin with a quote from Shaheed Mutahari, where he cites from the book of Mirza Hussain Nuri, where he says that Imam Hussain is indeed to be lamented, not only on account of the arrows and the spears that tore his body, but also on account of the fabrications and the additions that have been added to the event of Ashura and Karbala, as if to say that these additions, misinterpretations, and fabrications detract us from the central message that Imam Hussain was trying to impart through his grand, momentous sacrifice. Now, with that, I put the first question to our panelists. Considering this comment of Shaheed Mutahari, what are your thoughts on the accuracy of the popular narrative of Karbala, the authenticity of it and reliability of it? What are your thoughts? I would like to go to Dr. Komail to start the discussion.
Thank you, Sheikh, for this opportunity. You alluded to a very important aspect of this question. So as far as reliability and accuracy is concerned, first of all, I think we have to distinguish between history and historical narrative. What I mean by history and historical narrative is like history is something which has occurred in the past, whereas historical narrative is the account, how it is transmitted, how it is rendered for the later generation. Pretty much the same difference which scholars discuss in their works as far as Sunnat and Hadith is concerned. For example, Sunnat is something which Prophet did or he spoke or his tacit approval, whereas Hadith is a record of what he did or spoke or of his tacit approval. In the same way, we need to distinguish because there is a tendency of often conflating between these two, history and historical narrative. So what we have at our disposal is the narrative for that particular event. So when we have understood the difference between history and historical narrative, I think the critical question to be asked is like, what is the intention of author in rendering a particular event, in recording or transmitting a particular event? So, you know, some of like authors, their aim was to present the account, what they have heard from the previous generation. So their intention is to record what they have heard and they have put in their work. So that would be one type of sort of rendition. And there is other type of rendition or transmission, which is embellishment and sort of like, you know, narrating history for the masses, for communities. And in that respect, they would employ literary devices such as anecdotes, such as like poetic license, poetry, and all these things would be classified as something like what I call it historical narrative. So coming back to reliability or like authenticity or trustworthiness of the maqatil which we have at our disposal, I would, in a broader sense, I would like to classify into 4 different types. So the first type of the maqtal are the earliest maqtal which have been written. For example, Abu Mikhnaf, which we have been told, he had gathered all those reports and narrations which he had heard from first and the second generation who had witnessed the event. Unfortunately, we don't have those early maqtals of like mid-2nd century. And then all of those maqtal have been lost. So that's the first type. As I mentioned, like the first type of maqatil, we don't have at our disposal. We are not lucky enough to have preserved those first-hand or like second generation who have captured those events. The second type of maqatil would be those maqatil which have been extracted from the earliest sources, from the first category of sources. So, for example, Tabari, Baladuri, Ibn Atham, Al-Futu, Ibn Sa'd, Tabaqat, so Waqidi, so all those like, great scholars and giant historians, they have recorded history based on what they have captured from the first type of maqatil, which we don't have. So in that respect, the second type of maqatil are of utmost importance because they have faithfully transmitted the earlier events. The third type of maqatil are those maqatil which have been written not with the intention of recording history or like, capturing the event as they happened. Rather, the intention was to write for the community, for the masses, for cherishing those moments and for capturing the collective history of Shiism. I would classify Sheikh Mufid's Irshad, Ibn Tawus, Luhuf, or like to some extent Ibn Babawayh, Sheikh Saduq, when he writes and captures some of the events in his Amali, from both the sense, it might be reports or sometimes it's just a rendition of a story. These maqatil, the third category, are were written for a particular purpose with a specific intention, and the intention was to cater the need of the Shi'i community. And the fourth type of maqatil are later on, like from 9th century onwards, or I could say like 8th century onwards. For example, Ibn Numal Hilli. Later on, we see Rawdat al-Shuhada, Fadil Darbandi, and so on and so forth, Kashifi and Darbandi, and so on and so forth. So when the question of reliability comes, I personally would think, and I would like to hear the opinion of other scholars as well, that the first and the second sort of maqatil, they were capturing the events. And as far as history is concerned, I would prefer to rely on those maqatil as opposed to the third and the fourth one, because the intention was not to capture the history. It was not, the intention was not to record the history. The intention was to cater the religious needs and the religiosity of the collective memory of Shi'i community in those days. So when it comes to cherishing the event, when it comes to preserving the tradition, we are not discussing history over here. It's tradition. So there you go between, like, as I was mentioning, we need to distinguish between history and historical narratives, because narrative comes with some sort of embellishment and provisions to be added, the way people would understand. And scholars and authors would employ various techniques to address certain issues. So as far as third and fourth type of maqatil, I would say, like, from a historical point of view, those sources would be questionable as far as history is concerned.
So now I would like to go to Professor Takim. Considering this categorization of the maqatil literature, would you have any thoughts on quantifying how much of the popular narrative that we have, the standard narrative that we have, how much of that can be derived from the first and the second category of the maqatil literature? Can we at all quantify that?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The problem of going after what Professor Rajani has said is that most of what I wanted to say has already been said. So seriously though, I would also like to add another dimension to this before I answer your question, which is that many a time we tend to judge history by theology rather than the other way around. In fact, history comes before theology. But in many cases, especially the last two categories that Professor Rajani mentioned, many a time the history is somehow made to fit in with the theology, because certain theological issues, especially regarding the ilm al-ghayb of the Imam, for example, or some of the miraculous events, the history is molded to fit into the theological narrative. Whereas in reality, it should be the other way around. That is, theology goes around history. So, one can go into a lot of debate in this. As far as your question is concerned, it becomes problematic because, to me, a historian is like a good detective. A good detective cannot necessarily tell you who did it, but he can draw, or she can draw, a composite picture as to what possibly it may have looked like, or what possibly the face of this person who they are looking for looks like. And in many ways, this is what a historian has to do. There is also this tendency amongst people to engage in what we call hagiography, which is to see or embellish, as Dr. Rajani said, to embellish the figures so as to present the best possible way. To look for a person to look for and to try and quantify the first two sources that Professor Rajani mentioned, it is to some degree possible, not completely, but it comes with a great risk. So, for example, Nakan Saab, that you may have heard of, Shaheeda Insaniyat, when he mentioned, and there are several reports on this, that there was actually water in the camp of Imam Hussain after the seventh day, he was almost labeled a kafir because of that. Although historically, it may have been quite possible. Because somehow that destroyed the whole idea for us, the whole mourning attitude. Similarly, the last two sources that Dr. Rajani mentioned is primarily catered to not only the Shia community, but more importantly, the emotions of it. And if you try and destroy that emotion, you run the risk of the wrath of the community. The idea, for example, that Imam Ali came on the Shami Ghariban on a horse is highly problematic for many people. Or even if you look at Sheikh Mufid and the Shahadat of Ali Asghar, for example, where it's just a random arrow came and hit him, as opposed to the normal narrative. What I'm trying to say is that if we try to follow what you are saying, Sheikh, we would actually create many problems within the community, simply because the community would not be prepared to accept that, because it destroys a lot of the images and the hagiography and the embellishment that we have built up.
Well, thank you for that comment, and I appreciate the concern that the community might end up rejecting the faith altogether if there's any distortion from the speakers in terms of what they understand to be the narrative. However, our task is to work through this and try and get some understanding of what is happening in terms of the narrative of Karbala. For Mutahari to lament in the way that he lamented begs the question, is there something wrong and does something need to be done? So pursuing that particular topic, we go to Sayyid Fadlallah. Ayatollah Mutahari quotes that the popular narration of the mother of Hazrat Ali Akbar being present on the day of Ashura is actually unreliable altogether, that Lady Layla was not there on the day of Ashura. So now with that, we bring into the question the whole emotional rendition of the story of Hazrat Ali Akbar going to the camp, Imam Hussain asking Bibi Layla to come with him and to pray so that Ali Akbar comes back. What are your thoughts on the whole issue of, let us just say, the existence of Lady Layla in Ashura, and subsequent to that, what are your thoughts of narrating her presence and all the emotive story that we have of the final farewell of Hazrat Ali Akbar Salamullah alayhi?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you first for this event. This is actually a problematic issue regarding what's popular actually towards a very big or sensitive issue like Karbala or Ashura. We are talking about an issue which is related to the Imam Hussain alayhi salam first, and Secondly, it is related to 1,400 years and above. There is a kind of accumulation and also impact from the different societies, cultures. We have also variation in circumstances along this whole a big time, actually. The mentality as well, we have the impact of mentalities, different mentalities of the narrators from one side, and also from the khutaba or the mullahs and the writers also of the narratives. Let me first put a point or a line under this a very important idea regarding what I think about, what I think actually. The first, we have to, relating with Ashura in general, we have to start from a certain point, which is actually the what Dr. Kumail said. We have the earliest narrators, and those, even if we don't have their maqatils, we have their narrations of the historical event. And I don't think that it's a good, it's a big deal to distinguish between the history and the historical narration. Regarding narration of the historical event, we are talking here, for example, about Abu Makhnaf, who was narrating what was happening in Ashura, in Karbala. So there is no distinction between the history and the historical narration of the incidents, because what we have actually as an history, we have the narration of that history. So this is, I think, a very important point to start from. The second point regarding the incidents of Ashura, I think if we relied on that, there is a variation in mentalities or societies, cultures along the whole time. So we may find I think it's very normal to find exaggerations, relying, for example, on heroic scheme that one is trying to maybe draw. We may find fabricating of incidents that's not found in order to maybe establish some ideas which also that society in a certain time get benefit from it. So I think here we have an important point regarding the whole issue of Ashura, is that the core of Ashura, what's the core of Ashura as the whole issue or the event that we are going to state on or to deal with every year. The core is Imam Hussain alayhi salam. This is the big issue. All the details must be going around this core. We have not to forget that the core is Imam Hussain alayhi salam. So for me, for example, what's the problem if Layla, the mother of Ali al-Akbar, was in Ashura or wasn't in Ashura? So for me, it doesn't matter, because the core of Ashura is Imam Hussain. The axis of the whole issue is Imam Hussain alayhi salam. So Layla will be let me say, it's not a senior player in this issue. So but let me say, if we build in a certain society a big issue on this incident, then there will be a big problem if we deny, for example, or Shahid Mutahari or any other scholar denies, for example, Layla was found or not found in Ashura. For me, I think we have to start from the events. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says, قَلِيلُ الْحَقِّ يَكْفِي مِنْ كَثِيرِ الْبَاطِلِ. I think if we relied, for example, on Abu Makhnaf narrations, which is narrated in At-Tabari, or which is gathered by Sheikh al-Yusufi or other writers in some books, So we find a very logical incidents which are maybe we find this kind of logic in the incidents which come an incident which comes after another incident. We have this kind of let me say it is something far from al-ghaib, or what we consider as ghaib. So there is no miracles in Ashura. Otherwise, why Imam Hussain should be killed in that way? So I think we have to deal with this issue from that point of view, and to start from what Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said, قَلِيلُ الْحَقِّ يَكْفِي مِنْ كَثِيرِ الْبَاطِلِ. But if we want to get benefit to the maybe a reasonable level from Ashura, I think we have to get Ashura to our time. This is the whole problem. I think what was Sheikh Mutahari was doing is that he was talking about Ashura as the, let me say, an issue which maybe elaborates the revolution against the oppression and the big issues in their society. So he was stressing on the Ashura as the source of power, not Ashura as the source of weakness. So this is another mentality.
We are going to come to that discussion in just a little while as to what do we envisage from the whole narrative and what do we want to impart and how do we want to convey the message of Imam Hussain. But just on that note, when you said that the central theme is Imam Hussain, I would like to ask an ethical question. When we narrate the events of Ashura and we do not know them to be accurate, should we be qualifying that this is something that I have heard, I have read, but not necessarily accurate? Now, I'll take you to the pressing theme of the wedding of Hazrat Qasim on the night of Ashura. Now, the modern listener, when they hear this event, they will say, well, they knew that they will die on the following day. And Qasim was of a tender age. How can Imam Hussain be thinking of marriage on such a night where they should be devoting themselves, and especially of such a young child of Imam al-Hassan? So is there a red line that needs to be drawn? I do understand your argument that there are many things that are there right now that we can't deal with. And I'll indeed come back to this question that the whole narrative will become very dry and unfulfilling. That is something we will come to in a little while. But for now, I understand we are having a little bit of a problem connecting with Aalima Zakia, but if she is connected, can she come in? What do you think are the ethical lines where we should actually we should avoid entering into certain parts of the narrative because they are so totally inconsistent and they project the Imam in a very negative light or set confusion in the mind of the modern listener? Aalima Zakia, sorry, Sayyid.
Yes, I think briefly I'll say here that the problem here, when I said that the core is Imam Hussain alayhi salam, the problem is that what's the image of Imam Hussain in the minds of people? We will see that the image will variates amongst the societies or the cultures that we have. According to this, we may find that some societies or some cultures find no problem in that the wedding of Qasim alayhi salam. But for me, for example, if you ask me, I'll find the whole issue of Karbala was the issue of reforming the Islamic, the existence of Islam in the society, reforming the minds, the culture, the whole society. There was a big problem and issue, and the Imam Hussain was the Imam of Islam. According to this, the image of Imam Hussain will not be far from the image of the Islam in general. According to this, this will be maybe this will be considered as a harmful image, which will harm the image of Imam Hussain, the image of Ashura, the lessons that we have to derive from Ashura. So I think we have to put a red line and to distinguish between the issues that serve the whole, let me say, the whole issue of Ashura, and the issues or the incidents that it doesn't matter if it is or not. So it would be, and also the issues that maybe could be harmful for the whole incident and the derivation from Ashura for our time and our issues that we deal with.
So I would like to build on that sentiment. Dr. Komail, I believe Aalima Zakia is having problems connecting. Dr. Komail, you had a seminar a couple of years ago in which you discussed the whole story of Hazrat Abdullah al-Radi, Hazrat Ali Asgar, that how it developed over the ages. If you could just describe that for us, and then going to Professor Takim's comment that a lot of theology is justified through history. So basically, our theological take is that the Imam talks with God directly. And in the narrative of Hazrat Ali Asgar, we have this particular part in which there is a cry from the heavens upon the soul of Imam Hussain, telling him to let go of the baby, giving him over to God. So that theology is then established or emphasized through that particular narrative. If you could just shed some light on that as to the story of Hazrat Ali Asgar Salamullah alayhi, how it has evolved and developed over the 4 periods that you talked of the Maqatil literature.
Thank you, Sheikh. And if you allow, I would like to slightly go back to what Said Jaafar Fadlallah has alluded to, because I have a sort of disagreement over here, and I would like to learn more from him and like other panelists. I think this is a slippery slope. If we were to, allow certain narratives, if it does not harm the overall message of Abu Abdullah al-Hussain alayhi salam, simply for the fact it would be very subjective. First of all, some scholars might see that it is consistent with the overall image of like Karbala, but others might see no, this is not something which is consistent with the message of Ashura. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is, if we were to allow and to allow creeping in those material which comes from the 3rd and the 4th category of Maqatil, which I classified, the issue would be eventually it's going to build on and on, thinking like, fine, it's consistent with the message of Imam Hussain, and it does not cause any harm, and rather it's encouraging people for the religiosity. The issue is we are compromising on other certain aspects. For example, like, there are always 10 to 15%, I'm giving just rough estimate, 10 to 15% among the audience who have inquisitive mind, who are looking for the records which we have in our books, as opposed to traditional sort of embellishment and hagiographical literature. So for them, the community has nothing to cater for. And for example, if they were left alone with, all the stories which we hear and which our scholars have mentioned that they are not something which comes from the 1st and the 2nd category of literature, we are doing a great disservice to those 15% of inquisitive minds. And I'm not saying like, we should rather come in a radical approach and there needs to be a sensitive approach as to how to address those issues. And we just gave 2 examples over here, like, the marriage of Qasim or the mother of Ali Akbar. But as we all know, Muhaddis Noori in his Lolo wa Marjan lists like, 30 items. It's not just 1 or 2, 30 items. And Muhaddis Noori, we all know, he had those well, I don't want to say akhbari, but he had a sort of passion towards narrations and hadith, and he has collected like, a good bunch of like, hadith. And Sheikh Abbas Qumi, think him of like, being a traditionist is because of his teacher Muhaddis Nuri. So Muhaddis Nuri, despite the fact his utmost reverence and respect to ahadith, and we see few scholars in that particular and writes Lolo Marjan and lists like 30 items just to say that these are something which are addition to the overall history of Karbala. So he had some issues concerning these events. So I think at some point of time, I would like to just like list like a couple of things which comes to my mind. Marriage of Qasim, mother of Ali Akbar, and the Masaib. Normally we read or like we hear, or the daughter of Muslim.
Komel,
Yeah.
if I can just interrupt there as well.
Yeah.
It's not only the marriage of Hazrat Qasim, but the ceremonies that are built on that marriage all are practiced, and they become somehow ordained and get a religious coloring. So that's a further implication of it.
I completely concur, and that builds like the concern which Muhaddis Nuri has is like if we allow these to happen. For example, now I'm coming to Ali Akbar Ali Asghar alayhi salam, the point which you mentioned, and I would like to specifically allude to, just building on that point, like when the narration is crept into from like I won't call it secondary literature, but like later on when the narration comes like Imam Sadiq took the baby and portrayed in a majlis, so people started crying. So that would be practice, and that is another ceremony which would be would be practiced in different communities. So you are completely right. It's not about just narrative, but these narratives come into the form of ceremony. So coming back to now the question of it's not about certain events being fabricated or narrated. Rather, the authentic events are embellished and built layer upon layer. So for example, a couple of years ago, I gave a seminar on looking at taking the case study of Ali Asghar, the little baby of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, how the Masaib, which was just in one line in Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'ad and then in the Maqtal of Musab bin Zubayr, in each I have classified from each generation, each century, how one line Masaib got to 3, from 3 to became 20 lines, from 20 to become 2 paragraphs, then 5 paragraphs, so on and so forth. To the extent that baby was killed, then it came like, Imam buried him. He went like, 7 steps front and backward. And that becomes Shigarif, as you said, that becomes ceremony, because that is something which Shia would practice on the day of Ashura. And then it comes like, he was buried, and then Rabab was there with him, and so on and so forth. So in that seminar, the whole idea was to just showcase an example how the Masaib are embellished throughout the centuries, from one line to several minutes, if not hours.
So before we come to the ethics of how we ought to narrate the whole event of Karbala, I would like to come to Professor Takim and ask, well, if we were to look at the bare facts, obviously you're not advocating that, but if we were to look at the bare facts of the events of Karbala, they would become very dry and unsatisfactory. And we are accustomed to feeling that pain relating to Imam Hussain emotionally. Now, with that in mind, is there a pressure upon the orators to legitimately embellish? And is there an allowance for poetic license? And especially considering the narrations such as Man Baka, or Abka, or Tabaka, or the person who cries will inherit paradise. Professor Takim, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a difficult question, but at the same time, it's something, as one who has been reciting majalis and especially the anecdotes of Karbala for a very long time, it has always been at the back of my mind. And I think that it all boils down to the ethics of the orator himself or herself. That as an orator, I feel that I'm responsible, because in many ways, I'm carrying that burden of Karbala and I'm trying to impart it to the people. I'm kind of a bridge between the text and the audience. And I carry that, and not only me, but any orator for that matter, carries that great burden. Ultimately, we have to search our conscience and see what is where the ethics are. Am I allowed, or is it okay for me just to say anything in order to move my audience and to make them cry? To me personally, the message of Imam Hussain alayhi salam is so powerful and so evocative that I do not need to embellish it at all in order to make people cry. Because Imam Hussain doesn't speak to my eyes, he speaks to my heart. And when you speak to someone's heart, then the heart moves and the body moves because of that. So, in other words, as a orator, as orators, we have to be very conscientious in what we say, even though it may go against the grain of what people have heard. And sometimes you're not sure because the sources themselves are conflicting. Let's not just blame the people or the orators, but we have a lot of issues with the source material too, that the ulama themselves sometimes are divided. And we say, well, did this really happen? To give you an example, when I was a student in Qom, around 35 years ago, and I remember this anecdote distinctly, I asked an alim, who is now an ayatollah, said, that this is what Tabari is saying. And his response was, Tabari durugh ziyad mige, that Tabari is a great liar. Now, if you remove Tabari, and I know that he is Sunni, but he is one of the more reliable Sunni speakers. And let's not forget, Tabari doesn't make it up. He actually tells us his sources. He tells us, وَقَالَ Abu Mikhnaf, Abu Mikhnaf, and so on. So the point being that sometimes I say, okay, maybe this may have happened. And I say that, according to him, this is what he's saying. I feel that way, that I'm removing the burden off my shoulders. But if I find that something that could not possibly have happened, logically, theologically, rationally could not have happened, then I will not say it. And, even though people may not like it, but to give you, I don't want to take too much of your time because I know time is running short, but to give you just a small example of how sensitive these issues are. When I said to the audience that there was no horse in Karbala called Dhul Janah, I said, what? He says, well, the horse of Imam Hussain wasn't called Dhul Janah. That name was a much later appellation by a poet. Dhul Janah means one who has got wings. His actual name was Lahiq, that he was a very fast horse that Imam Hussain actually gave to Ali Akbar to ride. But then you have this other narrative that the horse was from the Prophet ﷺ. It could not have been, because horses only live for 25 years maximum. The period between when the Prophet died ﷺ, that was in 632, and the events of Karbala in 680 was much more than that, almost 50 years, 49 years. And so on. So you have to try and measure all these up before we as speakers, as I said, we have a lot of responsibilities, and we will be questioned if we make up stories or we recite things which are against our conscience, because this is not my or your pulpit, it's the Prophet's pulpit as far as I'm concerned. And therefore we carry a lot of responsibilities in what we say.
Thank you. Sayyid Jaafar, obviously if we know something is false, we should be careful in narrating it. As Professor Takim is saying, we are responsible to God sitting on the pulpit of the Prophet. We have to be responsible in narrating the truth, and that is what the Quran commands us to do. However, in terms of events that have occurred, like the shahada of Abdullah al-Radi', Hazrat Ali Asgar, now, are we not allowed to somehow convey the emotions felt by Imam Hussain? History, those one or two lines that the Imam was carrying a baby and a random arrow came and slit its throat, is not doing justice to what the Imam must have felt at that point, and the mother of that little child must have felt. So is it not legitimate for us to at that point then intervene, take poetic license to express the emotional state of the Imam and the sentiments of the Imam to convey that scene more realistically? That can surely not be problematic.
Thank you. Just, I want to, maybe I caused some misunderstanding. Dr. Kumail, I wasn't saying that what is not harming the image of Ashura or Karbala, that we are allowed to fabricate it, or we are allowed to say that even if it is not logical, then we have to narrate it or to recite it. No, actually, I said we have to start or rely on the authentic narration of Ashura, and this is relying on the earliest narration of the event or the incidents. And we will find many and rich, actually, content that we can build on in reciting the maqta. But let me say that the image, if it is harming or not harming the image, I think here the image is the big issue. Because the image of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, I was criticizing indirectly what is going on. Because the image of Imam Hussain alayhi salam is not unique. You will find many images of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. So some people will deny something, and we as reasonable people, we deny many things, like the horse that Professor Takim was talking about, for example. Even when we say in Tarikh al-Tabari, or Abu Makhnaf was narrating the maqtal of Abdullah al-Radi', he didn't say that he threw the blood towards the sky and no drop of the blood comes down. No, he didn't say this. He said he poured the blood into the ground and said, Allahumma in taku habasta anna an-nasr faj'al dhalika lima wa khair. This is a very big, very spiritual stance of Imam Hussain at that incident, because there is tawakkul ala Allah, there is a love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is a kind of dissolving his soul in the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was saying dua to Allah, and at that incident of killing his son so no matter how his son is killed. So according to this, I think the problem here is the mentalities that we find in our society. I'm trying to make or categorize what's going on in our societies, not in our Shia society. We don't have one society here. So according to this, I think we have to, as I said, rely on the phrase or the narration of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. It's very good narration or base. قليل الحق يكفي من كثير الباطل. He means that we don't have to fabricate. We are not allowed even to fabricate, because this is a lie and it is forbidden. The few of the truth is more fruitful than the plenty of non-truth. This is what Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said. Because of this, we rely on the authentic incidents of Ashura, and I stress on this. We have to prove, and we have to not to overcome or to deny what contradicts each other between the incidents that we have. If we hear or listen to the reciting of the maqatil, we will find many contradictions. Nowadays, this is a big problem, because this will get some people away from the incident of Ashura. They will find it unlogical. They will find the Ashura as a whole issue they will not be concerned about. According to this, in order not to have dryness of this Ashura or reciting, I think the poetry here is very important, and the modern poetry, not the modern in the style. I mean the modern which concerns with the issue that we are dealing with. This is very important. This will give a supportive, emotional feelings to the incident itself. So you can say in the narrative there is this incident. This is the incident in this detail, only in these details, this and that. But when you go to poetry, you will have a rich emotional meanings, and you will build without lying, without fabricating. So I think we have to give an alternative here. This is the issue. We have to give the modern people another kind of reciting the maqtal, which is based on logic, which is based on knowledge, which is based on the real image of Imam Hussain, which cannot be built except by referring to the Islam and the rules and the basis that we have and the morality of Islam, the image of the Prophet. It will not differ then. And then we have to give efforts to the styles that we have, or to the way that we express the incident of
Sayyid Fadlallah, because we are running out of
yes,
time, and we have 2 more questions to get through before we come to the questions that are being asked by our audience. All 4 of you are from different regions of the world. Now, I would like to ask a question and would like a very brief answer. Do you feel that the popular narrative of Karbala is conveying the message of Imam Hussain? You have all said or hinted at this, that Imam Hussein's central message was reform. Islah fi ummati jaddi. I want to just bring goodness, reconciliation, betterment. What Imam Hussain meant, we all know, was to bring people back to the Islam of the Blessed Prophet. That was the central message Imam Hussain was trying to impart. Do you think the way that the Karbala story, the recounting of the events stand at present, are they conveying that message of Hussain ibn Ali? Very, very briefly before we move on to the next major question. Sayyid Fadlallah, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Actually, my answer is it depends on the society. It depends on the practice that we have, the challenges that we face. So you will find maybe in some societies, maybe the message of Imam Hussain alayhi salam is fulfilled even by a certain ratio, no problem. But you will find that in some societies, yes, there is a problem. The image that or the message of Imam Hussain alayhi salam does not reach actually many societies, because we have a problem in the dealing of those societies. If we find the message does not reach those societies because there is a societal problem, there is many problems regarding the the assembling of Islam by this society. So the practice here, the challenges, the stance of those communities or societies will impact the deriving or derivation of the message from the reciting, and also the reciting itself will maybe give an obstacles for these, because they are not raising the conscience, but they are maybe going down.
Professor Taqiyim, Imam Hussain is a very brave warrior, relying upon Allah and doing the right thing. He is not deterred from speaking the truth or standing defiantly in the face of oppression. He wants to put things right. Is it being conveyed through the Karbala narrative as we have now?
Again, very briefly, I think we, in our lectures, we focus more on how he died rather than why he died. And because of that, the central message is being diluted. I'm not saying that we're not citing it, we are not talking about it, we are. But there's more overwhelming emphasis on how he died, because that makes people emotional, that makes them cry. Rather, the purpose is lost and is being diluted. I would say there's this much also for any reciter, that any historical narrative loses meaning unless and until it is somehow connected to the ethical values that we uphold today. In other words, the whole purpose of Imam Hussein's mission was that of Tawheed, that is the oneness of God, that we should be God-centered. Our whole life should be centered on Allah. We need to connect that central message of Imam Hussain, because when you have Tawheed, you also have that, you give everything for his and the Islah, etc. We need to connect that particular message of Imam Hussain with what it means to be a morally committed human being in today's world. In other, the moral values of what it means to be a Muslim now. Think that way, especially with the younger generation, they can connect not only with the speaker, but more importantly, they can connect with the message of Imam Hussain more clearly once you have that idea of moral commitment to the message of Imam Hussain.
So now I want to come back to that right at the end. But Dr. Kumail, continuing with the same question. Now, let me just say and add something more to it, that we are in a way conveying the message of defiance of Imam Hussain and his struggle for the truth. For example, we know at the time of the toppling of the Shah of Iran, it was the women who came out in the streets of Tehran chanting Ya Hussein, beating their chests in the love of Imam Hussain and in defiance of the curfew set by Shah. Similarly, when we saw the interviews of the mothers and fathers of Lebanon against the occupation that was there, they too were motivated into action, selflessness, and the spirit of sacrifice through the remembrance of Imam Hussain. Again, in Afghanistan, when they interviewed women who were belonging to the Imami faith, they responded that we sent our sons in front of the raging Russian tanks, USSR tanks at that point, because Zainab sent her own and Muhammad into the battlefield. So if you look at all of that, we are seeing that as emotional, as distorted as the narrative may be, it is somehow conveying that central sentiment of Imam Hussain, that my head will not bow in front of other than Allah, and I fight for liberty and freedom and the right of the oppressed. Dr. Kumail.
Yeah, I absolutely concur. And Ashura and the event of Imam Hussain has huge potential. I mean, many things could be learned and disseminated of this event. And so far, like throughout the centuries, people have learned a lot of things, and the people have tried in one way or other to highlight the core message of Imam Hussain. However, I personally see Imam Hussein's message as being propagated today. Somehow it is devoid of the word Islam. The core reason why Imam Hussain gave his life was for Islam, as Professor Taqi has mentioned, ubudiyya, or God centricity. But somehow it has become more of an emotional event for all of us, which needs to be, because emotion plays a huge role in keeping these memories alive. But if we collectively fail to highlight the mission of Imam Hussain as someone who has given his life for God, someone who exemplified the message of Quran and the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet, then I think we need to revisit the fact that we have failed to disseminate this message among our Sunni brothers and sisters. It shows we are lacking something as far as the message of Imam Hussain is concerned.
So before we move on to the final segment of our discussion, there are quite a few questions that have come in from our audience. Now, in those questions, there is one particular one that I would like to ask you before we move into the final leg of our discussion, and that is that we hear from the orators that Imam Zainul Abidin miraculously came to Karbala on the 11th of Muharram, identified the bodies of the Shuhada and buried them. Is this factual and reliable? If not, then how did the Bani Asad discern who the bodies belonged to? And can we be sure that the body attributed to Imam Hussain was Imam Hussein's body? So it's a very packed question.
Is it directed to me?
No, to the panel.
Okay.
If you can all give briefly your thoughts.
Yes.
And I remember reading a riwayah where the 9th Imam was alleged to bury the 8th Imam. And the questioner said, well, how did the ninth Imam make it from Medina? At that point, he was in Medina to Tus and bury the eighth Imam. So the response was that if the fourth Imam could miraculously go from Kufa to Karbala, then why can't the ninth Imam do the same? So on the theology derived from the event of Karbala, we have another subsequent justification. So it's an interesting question if we can shed some light on it. I'll tell you what, Dr. Komail, I'll go to say Jaafar first in this one and then I'll come back.
Actually, if we want to talk about a miracle, then we have to prove it. So we believe that we believe in the miracles of that Quran mentioned, because they are mentioned in Quran, and we know that it is authentic. But according to narratives, then we have to prove it. If you find, for example, that the narrative which says that the Imam ﷺ returned back in the 11th of Muharram and buried the bodies, then it is, for example, found in a source which is written in the 8th or 9th century. So how could you prove this? So I think it's not a matter of a miracle or to believe in or not. It is a matter of proving that this has been occurred at that time, then no problem. And I think many obstacles comes in front of this issue.
So then you're raising a huge problem, Professor Taqi.
Yes.
Who buried Imam Hussain and how did they identify his body, and can we be sure that that is Imam Hussein's body that is in the shrine?
Yeah,
so very difficult.
Do not forget that there was a tribe which was living close by, and they witnessed the battle. In fact, according to many reports, they belong to, of course, the tribe of Habib ibn Madahir, the Banu Asad. They witnessed it. In fact, Habib actually tried to get them on board, but he was blocked. They were prepared to help Imam Hussain.
That's
but
right.
They were
We hear
blocked
that.
by
Yeah.
Umar ibn Saad's army. But what that tells us is that they saw. Now, although most of the clothes were removed, they could see who was Imam Hussain, because he was there prominent all the time. The kind of clothes he was, the kind of stature, the kind of body he had. And it is true, there was no head. But that does not mean that you cannot identify a body on its own by the size, sometimes by the clothes that they were wearing, and so on. So there were distinguishing marks. And from what I understand from historically, that yes, at least the body of Imam Hussain that we know of has been identified is the one. And do not forget that some of the reports that we get are not only, I mean, one thing that we have not touched on, and maybe you can touch on in other sessions later on, as to we're focused on Abu Mikhnaf, but there are other reporters who were there also in Karbala. Humayd bin Muslim was one of them. We hear also from Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam as another reporter. But some of them were still there on the 11th of Muharram. So it's quite possible that they may have identified that, look, since we're going to bury, this was Hussain and this was the rest.
I think that's a reasonable response, that even if we cannot prove the miraculous appearance of the fourth Imam, we can still be satisfied that these are the bodies as they have been labeled, or these bodies were identified accurately, because there was no need to keep Hazrat Abbas's body at such a distance at the Al-Qama and Imam Hussein's at this side. And then again, Dr. Komail, I would like to come back, finally come to you on this question before we ask a concluding question. And that is, well, can't we rely on the reports from Imam Sadiq Salamullah alayhi or Imam Bakir if they have visited the shrine of Imam or the grave of Imam Hussain for ziyarah, and if they have identified the body of Imam Hussain? Can we not therefore take that as an authentic source if we cannot prove anything else?
Yeah, as far as the burial is concerned, what I recall is like Sheikh Mufid does mention that Umar bin Saad, before he left, took the caravan towards Kufa, Bani Asad, when he took, Bani Asad came and they buried. So there is no mention of Imam Sajjad alayhi salatu wasalam until we come to the Safid period, and Allama Majlisi, in fact, he mentions supposedly Imam Sajjad is the one. that is what I would call it like back projection. What I mean by back projection is sometimes our ideas are theologically constructed at some stage, and based on those theological ideas, we get stuck how to interpret history then. Right? For example, the theological discussion over here is La yalil wasi illal wasi. So only an imam can pray on the dead body of an imam. So that is theologically constructed in the 4th and 5th century. So now later on, Allah Majlisi would come and say, like, if this is the case, and if we were to take this as a face value, as a belief, how we would reconcile with such issues of imam. And then, there might be interpretation, and there comes the tafsir of tariq. As we, when we stuck with the Quranic verse, we have tafsir, we have interpretation. So there comes the interpretation of tariq, and that is Imam Sajjad would supposedly come, and then it becomes like, the core belief that, definitely Imam Sajjad came. So I think the critical question to be asked over here is that one, La yalil wasi illal wasi. Do we need to hold that theological belief? Does that constitute as an article of faith, as opposed to going back to the historical event?
Obviously, that is beyond the remit of our discussion at present. But I would like to conclude this session and with one more question, and that is, given that we have problems with the narrative of Karbala, yet it is moving people in the right direction. It is filling them with confidence about their own humanity, about their relationship with the Imam, about their relationship with God. However, the point of relationship with God, as Dr. Komail pointed out and Professor Takim and Sayyid Jaafar hinted at, that aspect of God's centricity somehow has become watered down. It has become more Imam-centric. Is there anything we can do? As Sayyid Jaafar quoted the powerful poetry, powerful statement of Imam Hussain at the death of Hazrat Ali Asghar. It's a very moving statement, and it can bring about that spiritual bonding with God and make us God-centric. Is there anything we can do through the story that we have of Imam Hussain that we deem as authentic, that we can bring it more towards God's centricity, so that people, when they hear about Imam Hussain, they're moved with emotions, they are passionate for the cause of humanity, and at the same time they become spiritual beings and God-centric? Professor Takim, just very brief answers.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought this up, because I think this is the core of the message of Imam Hussain, which is God's centricity. And just to give you 2 or 3 anecdotes that we all know, but I think we need to emphasize it continuously. That, for example, during the battle, as you are aware, Imam Hussain is standing there watching at Dhuhr time, and somebody comes up to him, says, I want to pray behind you. And the word that Imam Hussain used, قَدْ ذَكَرْتَ الصَّلَاةَ يَا أَبَا ثَمَامٍ. You have remembered the prayers. جَعَلَكَ اللَّهُ مِنَ الْمُصَلِّينَ الذَّاكِرِينَ. May Allah make you amongst those who have remembered the prayers. So that just goes to show the significance of the prayers. And even on the night of Muharram, when he hears that the enemy is approaching, what does Imam Hussain say? لا 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 نصلي لربنا, so that we can pray to our Lord, because هو يعلم إني قد كنت أحب الصلاة له. That I always used to love to pray to him. You don't just pray, you pray with love. وَتِلَاوَةَ كِتَابِهِ, and so on. And of course, this God's centricity is seen so many times on the day of Ashura, where Imam Hussain turns to Allah at various points, notably at the last point when he was all alone. He says, Ya Allah, you know that everything that I've given, or everything that I've sacrificed is because of my love for you only. This day when everybody has now forsaken me, my enemies are rejoicing, my friends are no more, I complain to you only. That sense of God's centricity and complete submission to Allah is what I think we should be focused more on, and that I think that will touch the core of the hearts of the audience.
Thank you. Sayyid Jaafar?
Yes. Without understanding Islam, our Tawheed and justice, and the functions of the whole basis of Islam, without understanding well the movement of the Prophet ﷺ, also the stances of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali alayhi salam and Al-Hasan. So how could we understand Ashura. I think the lack of understanding Ashura is due to the lack of understanding our Islam. I think if we understood our Islam well, our Quran well, our Sunnah well, our Imams well, I think we can see Ashura in a very shiny image, and we can derive from this event every year what is useful for our societies to move on and to go towards to build maybe a different civilization based on the two poles or two dimensions, the material one and the spiritual one.
Thank you, Syed Jaafar. Dr. Kumail, would you like to just conclude with your remarks?
I think the core message is I would like to say Imam Hussain alayhi salam. For personally, I can relate to my Imam Hussain as a practical example of Dua Arafah on the day of Ashura. So Ashura without Dua Arafah is meaningless. So the epitome of the sacrifice of Imam Hussain could be concluded. So if Imam Hussain recited Dua Arafah in Mecca, that was recitation, but his practicality and Dua Arafah in practice could be seen in on the day of Ashura when he says Allahumma ja'alni akshaka anni arak, or like fajma'ni alayk bi khidmatin tusiluni ilayk. So these are like, the way if we understood Imam Hussain as the practical Dua Arafah on the day of Ashura, that would be different Imam Hussain for me.
I thank you all for coming and discussing on this panel. For the benefit of our viewers, please join us again tomorrow, where the discussion will revolve around du'as and ziyarats relating to Karbala. Tomorrow, inshallah, we'll be joined by Dr. Kumail Rajani, Dr. Sayyid Qari Fatimi, Dr. Amina Inlos, and Sheikh Vinay Khatia. Once again, I thank my panelists. It is a great shame that Aalima Zakia Batool could not contribute. She was present, and we are thankful for that. May Allah bless us all and allow us to learn from Imam Hussain and to convey in the best possible manner. Wassalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.